Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is Bocar Dia. Bocar is a managing director at Forum Ventures, where he supports early stage founders in establishing their target customers, getting rapid traction, and establishing their sales motion in the early days of their startup. So Bocar comes to Forum Ventures with many years of experience, both as a combination of a thought leader in the go-to-market landscape. He's been a sales coach at Harvard Business School, revenue.fyi, and scaling to100.com. He was also a very early employee at Hootsuite, where he was there for almost 8 years, starting as a sales rep, pre-revenue, and then leading multiple go-to-market teams throughout its growth to $150 million in ARR, 1,500 employees, and approximately $300 million in funding. So this is a man who has been in the role of early stage, growth stage, and helped scale a company, a very successful company in Hootsuite. Since then, his roles have been consistently focused on building out revenue generation strategies, growth strategies for early stage, growth stage startups just like you. Nowadays, as part of his work as managing director at Forum Ventures, they support and invest in over 120 startups a year. Yes, 120 startups per year. So before you go and leave the podcast and go check out Forum Ventures, make sure you listen to this episode first, because it's going to be important if you want to reach out to Bocar and his team about an investment. So some of the things that we talked about in my conversation with Bocar is, number one, much of what he does is very data oriented. So over the last couple of years, he's interviewed hundreds of founders, not just the ones that he invests in, but people outside of the portfolio. And in talking to those early stage founders and their early stage go-to-market team, what he's done is collected a ton of information and data as to how to build a successful early stage go-to-market motion. One of the topics that we talked a lot about is what he calls launch partners and design partners and launch partners, these two different types of early stage customers for you, and how important they are as an early stage company to start with design partners, move into launch partners, as a way to identify the core problem that you're solving, the core market that you're targeting, and the people in those organizations that you're selling to. We talked a lot about what does it take for an early stage startup to land that pre-seed round, then the seed round, then a Series A funding round, all those different benchmarks that you probably want to know about so that you can make sure you're staying on track in those checkpoints for your funding goals as you think about your go-to-market motion and your go-to-market growth. We talked a lot about the importance of founder-led selling early in a startup's growth journey, and to build what he calls an MVB, a minimal viable business motion, MVB. So we also talked about how Hootsuite, how he had a story that he shared on how he said no to Disney. Yes, he said no to Disney because of certain specific reasons, which was extremely painful and extremely hard for them to do, but turned out to be the right decision for them. And that's why, as a founder, you need to go through these steps that he's prescribing and that we're talking about. So make sure you check him out over at Forum Ventures. He's very active on LinkedIn. We'll put a link to his LinkedIn profile and a link to Forum Ventures in the show notes. So make sure you check out Bocar and his team over at Forum Ventures. And for now, let's head over to my conversation with him right now. Hey, Bocar, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Hey, Scott.
Yeah, it's, well, at the time we're recording this, it's been certainly an interesting week. And aside from the week here in the middle of March, it's been an interesting couple of months and even an interesting couple of years in our world of the startups. So just for the folks listening, as I always like to do, obviously you're managing director at Forum Ventures. So when people say, hey, like, what does that mean? What do you do every day? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll maybe start by kind of giving a sense of what Forum Venture is. So we're an early stage fund and accelerator. We do about 120 investments into predominantly B2B SaaS, so pre-seed and seed stage for the most part. What that means is that we get to see a lot of companies to invest in 120 of them every year. And the model that we have is really what attracted me to Forum. So Forum was an investor in my company when I was a founder, which is how I got to really know the team and the partners here. And our model is different in that we're very, very hands-on with the companies that we work with. And a lot of the focus on our accelerator program is really helping companies with their early sales and go-to-market and traction. So in a way, I act almost as a fractional go-to-market leader to the founders that we work with. So excited to have a conversation today because 0 to 1 sales is a conversation that I have day in and day out with the portfolio companies that I work with.
Well, I think maybe you just lost every listener because everyone probably just went to your website hearing that you invest in 120 companies every year. Like, okay, done. I got what I needed out of this episode. Somebody's writing checks. I'm there.
Wait until the end of the podcast to do that. But
yeah, exactly.
I do encourage you to do it.
No, for sure. Well, look, I mean, obviously, we've already done a little bit of an introduction about you before you and I got onto this part of our conversation, and with the pedigree that you have with 7, almost 8 years at Hootsuite. And then being an investor and advisor, you've been a fellow at On Deck, been a sales coach at Harvard Business School. So, there's so many topics we could talk about when it comes to early stage sales. Maybe just for purposes of definition, when you think of the phase of a company that is early stage, whether it's pre-seed, seed, like how do you define that is it based on product, revenue, customers, team size? Just curious to know how you define early stage.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's maybe a couple of ways to think about that, but I think they align quite well with how to think about it from a go-to-market standpoint anyway. Generally speaking, when you think about the evolution of a company at the early stages, right? Typically, you spend some time with customers identifying and really making sure that there is a real market pain there, right? So you have a hypothesis of a problem you want to solve, and you spend some time doing that, all the way to really getting your initial launch partners and design partners that you're going to work with, right? So a lot of the times when I say that, founders think about that 0 to 1 phase from a product standpoint, right? Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's parallel to that, that's very important actually when it comes to how you think about venture scale companies, is that while founders are always thinking about how to build a product from 0 to 1, investors are actually thinking about your company as it's not the minimum viable product. I think about the minimum viable business, so to speak, right? A business that's also going to be venture scale. So when I think about 0 to 1, I think about going from 0 to proving out to investors that you've got a business that's venture scale and that's worth investing in. And in my mind, and this aligns also with where folks invest, because things have recalibrated from 2020 and 2021. And let's not get into that, but let's just say that right now you probably need to be at around 200-ish or 250K-ish, have some revenue in the door, and have some conviction that you've got at least like a good product going and the beginnings of a business. That's what I define as that 0 to 1 phase is, have you proven out that you earned the right to get that seed funding, right? So once you prove those two things out, get to about 250K, get your seed funding, then there is really the real work that starts, which I think is really going from that 250K to $1 million ARR to $2 million ARR, getting your first 20, 30 customers if you're somebody on the enterprise space, more if it's SMB, more if it's other models. But fundamentally, I think I generally use revenue and places where you go out and fundraise as good benchmarks, because there's actually good reasons for it, I think. What venture does is that it does provide at least some good benchmarks and guiding posts along the way as you're building your company of things that you need to prove out, right? So 0 to 1 in my mind is prove out that you've got a product that works and it actually delivers on the promise of the solution to customers. Once you figure that out, then you really do need to spend some time figuring out what folks are starting to call go-to-market fit, which is really about, so you've got some early customers, but you before you start investing heavily in growth, you do have to figure out a repeatable, scalable motion, right? So typically that happens between, I'd say 250 and about, $2 million ARR at the earliest. But realistically, companies sometimes will go up all the way up to $10 million ARR and still haven't figured out their go-to-market fit, which is really when you should go out and actually invest in that sales and scale and make sure that you've got efficient growth.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this level of specificity there because, and that absolutely aligns with our perception here with our company and how we talk to clients. Like we think about that first 250, or I usually use somewhere between 100K and 300K in revenue.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, we call it the first 10. You got to get your first 10 paying customers.
Yeah.
And when you get those first 10, before you get to product market fit down the road, it's about product problem fit. It'll even alluded to that in the beginning of your answer, which was like, you have this hypothesis about a problem that you're solving.
Yeah.
So you build this product, and does it solve the problem? Yeah. So much so that people value it enough to give you money. So it's like, okay, I got 10 people, 10 customers. And, if it's a 10K a year ACV, it's like 30 of those, anywhere from 10 to 30 of those. If it's a 30K plus, it could be fewer. But the idea is like, okay, we found a marketplace of people that are willing to pay for our stuff. And that, as your point is taken, is enough of a business. You've proven a little bit of viability around this idea that you had. Then that seed round is then designed to help you accelerate sales.
Bingo.
So yeah, totally love that definition. There's something specific that you mentioned I wanted to trace back to for a moment, where you talked about those early customers being partners, like design partners. And there was another phrase you used related to the early
launch partners.
What was it? Launch partners.
Launch partners. Yeah.
So I would appreciate it if you could to just describe that a little bit more, because that word partner is a sort of ambiguous term, or used a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And sometimes wrongly so. So when you think about design partners or launch partners, how are you using those phrases?
I love that, because so the reality is there's good reasons to be calling them partners early stage that I can get into. But generally speaking, if I just maybe kind of paint a picture, and we kind of do this when we look at the evolution of kind of that early stage, we kind of think about 5 different stages of building, right? From the very beginning. Number 1 is you'll probably go and talk to 20, 30 customers, mostly to validate that the pain that you're looking at is real and it's a hair on fire urgency problem that people are actually willing to address. And I'll put a pin there. That's actually one area where a lot of founders kind of fail, and I can get back to it a little bit later. But once you've talked to 20, 30 customers and validated that you're solving a real market pain, then maybe you have another 40, 50 prospect conversations. And what you're doing there is that you're really trying to narrow in on specific high priority problems that will enable you to really figure out what that initial product should look like, right? So which brings you to stage 3, which is really about then designing and iterating on a solution to address those problems. And this is where design partners come in as a definition. I kind of think of design partners as these are customers that you've probably already had a conversation with in that process, that you think, based on some of the feedback that they had and some of the pain points that they shared, would be ideal initial customers for you. And typically what you do is that you'll have some initial workflow screens, maybe Figma screens, and you're talking to them to really figure out which one of these customers would be the right partners. And this is why I'm using the word partner for me to help me build my product. And that's what I call a design partner. Typically, you'll have 3 to 5 of those that you're going to work with closely, right? And really what you're trying to do is get to version 0.1 of your product. Once you get to a place where, you're building that initial product and these design partners are getting some value from using your solution, this is when I start thinking about launch partners. Now, launch partners think of as folks that are willing to take a bet on you prior to you announcing to the world that you've now built a product that's actually coming out to address the problem that you've identified. But there is a reason why you want to position it as launch partners versus early customers. I can get into that, but the TLDR there is that it's a motion. Calling them partners and running the motion that way enables you to have a little bit more control over the sale early stage, as opposed to, because you're early, nobody knows who you are. You don't really have that brand, equity, and you don't really have the trust yet in the market. The motion that I see founders do quite often is that they go and try to run a normal sales process with some of those early customers. And the reality is, because you haven't established a trust and you don't have these, case studies and things that you can point at, it's probably not the right motion. And I think a launch partner motion, and I can get into that a little bit later, is actually something that generally yields better results than just trying to run a typical sales process early stage.
Got it. Okay. All right, folks, we are off and running in my conversation with Bocar Dia. So Hey, we're talking about one of my absolutely favorite topics in the world, which is how do you get from 0 to 1? How do you get those first early stage customers for your startup? How do you build those first 10 customers? How do you get to the first million, the first couple million in revenue? And much of what we're talking about is that really like get down and dirty, if you will, as a startup founder, where you need to be involved with the sales process to really understand the customers that you're selling to, the problems that they have, to make sure that those early customers are successful. These are the kinds of strategies that we work on and help our clients build and implement every single day as part of our work at Sales Qualia. We've been doing this for about a decade and have now helped hundreds of startups all over the world in the B2B enterprise space. So if you are one of those early stage founders, and even if you're a little bit beyond that, maybe you're already at $1 million in revenue and you're trying to make those bigger jumps from 1 to 3 or 3 to 10, and you're hitting a little bit of headwinds, or you're finding that there's a little bit of struggle getting yourself out of founder-led selling and into a place where it's founder-less selling, a whole lot less of the founder being involved with the sales process, then chances are we could probably give you a hand on that. So even if you just want to grab a quick chat, get a second set of eyes, get some perspective on what you're doing, where you are, where you might have some blind spots or gaps in your sales process, in your management process, in your go-to-market motion, great opportunity for us to hop on a call, have a quick chat, and work on a few ideas for you and your startup. So easiest way to do that is to take your mobile phone right now, send me an email, scott@salesqualia, scott@salesqualia, QUALIA.com. Type the word private into the subject line. Just lets me and my assistant know you want to have a private chat about your company and your startup. We'll take over the rest. We'll get a call on the calendar and jam on some ideas. So scott@salesqualia.com, send me a note right now. And let's head back to my conversation with Bocar. And so, not to get too product focused, I do want to ask about the design partners, because and having lived through this myself with 3 different startups, where you obviously want to listen to the customer and understand what they're looking for. And then we also have to think about, well, it's the Henry Ford. If I asked people what they wanted, they'd ask for faster horses.
Yeah.
So, and I remember specifically when I was at Blend, when we were first launching our product, we had a design partner in a way, or this launch partner. And they had asked me as a salesperson, hey, it'd be really great if we could download these data into a spreadsheet. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. Let me go tell the product manager. And the product manager was like, are you effing crazy? I'm like, we're not doing that. I'm like, but that's what they want. He's like, we're trying to replace spreadsheets. We're not doing spreadsheets. Like, we need to teach them that spreadsheets is the wrong way. So I use that as an example because there's this sort of balance between giving them what they want versus what they need. And so, and again, I don't want to go too product-y in this conversation, but I'm just curious if there's some mistakes people make, or what are some things they should avoid in those early design conversations, design partner conversations.
That's a topic that we could probably have another podcast on at some point, right? So you're putting your finger on an interesting dynamic that I usually find. When you think about the early stage, right? Your sale is a little closer to almost a service sale than an actual product sale. And what I mean by that is the difference between selling a service and selling a product is that you've got to build product. The customer is going to buy the product first and get the value later. Whereas with a service, you have to kind of sell the value, and maybe there's some pilot that you have to do prior to the customer to getting the value, and then they'll pay you, right? And in a service type of motion, you say yes a lot more to customers than you would in a product type of motion, where by default, your answer to customers is usually no, right? Because you're not going to have one feature that will only work for that one customer. You're trying to build a product that will work for several customers. As a quick side note, I remember in my early days at Hootsuite, when we're really just kind of launching the enterprise product, and I was the sales rep on that, and you can imagine what my thoughts were at the time. We had a feature request from Disney out of all customers. And I think that if we delivered on that feature, we could land Disney as an initial customer. But I'll always remember the question that Ryan, my CEO at the time, asked me. And it was a very simple question. The question was, is this a feature that only Disney would use, or a feature that will be helpful to us across the board? And it was very evident, because our focus was on marketing teams, that Disney's feature request wasn't something that we should prioritize. And we actually said no to Disney, right? Imagine
I know that feeling. I know that feeling as a salesperson. Oh my gosh.
It sucks. But look, in hindsight, we did exactly the right things because we did have Disney as a customer later on once we actually built the platform to the way in which it was supposed to. All to say that what I would watch out for, so if you kind of go through the process the way in which I've kind of described it, where you have many conversations where you're not trying to sell, you're just really trying to learn, but you'll have 50, 60 conversations that are documented where you can actually take a look and go, let's select these 10 because we think that they're closer to the solution that we're thinking about. Then by doing that, by default, you're already preventing those feature requests from happening, right? What tends to happen is that founders will do is that instead of thinking about the solutions to the problem that they're solving, and it's very, and again, I've lived through this, it's very hard to look at a Disney on a list and go, they're not the right partner for us early stage, but quite often those great names are not the right partners for you early stage.
Yeah. So when I hear you talking to 50 or 60 different companies, it's a bit of a scatter plot. And I guess it sounds like you're looking for some clustering effect that sort of corresponds, or there's a Venn diagram that matches to the problem that you want to solve.
Yeah. And one thing to do before that, not to get too deep into really figuring out your ideal customer profile, is that so I didn't mention this at first. My background is actually technical, and I got into kind of sales. And I say that because I've always had more of a process or data-driven approach to sales.
Yeah.
And what I often tell our portfolio founders, and typically they'll be product leaders or technical leaders, right, that are building a company, and they've got kind of this experimental lens to building product, right, where they have a few hypotheses and they think about, potential solutions and really iterate and experiment that way. You have to do the very same experimentation in terms of go-to-market, whereby you have identified a pain point that you think some customers will have, and ideally you have 2 or 3 ICPs as a hypothesis. And you're having those conversations, but what you're doing as part of those conversations is you're trying to answer the question for yourself of, based on the 60 conversations that I've now had, say you had 3 and you talked to 20 customers in bucket number 1, 20 in bucket number 2, 20 in bucket number 3, what actually likely happens is that you'll end up focusing on one bucket once you start learning a little bit more about their pain points and really kind of getting that higher level definition. And then you'll expand by having more conversation with customers in that bucket. So effectively, at the end of that exercise, you should be at a point where you're actually very clear on the ICP that you're focusing on. And I'll add one more layer to this. That ICP better be an ICP that's also that also points at a venture scale outcome. Because that's one critical mistake that folks make, is that they'll generally, because you can find initial customers that have the pain point, you can build a solution for them. But if you didn't go through the exercise of going, hey, let me double check that there's enough customers that experience the pain point and are willing to spend the money in such a way that it's going to generate a $100 million business. Because I see companies that go all the way to sometimes Series B to Series B that haven't actually answered that question. So they'll get to $1 million of ARR and maybe get some funding for their Series A. And then what happens next? They'll just kind of stall for a while because their perspective or their assumption of what the market was invalidated from day one. And you can actually validate that before even writing a single line of code, I think.
Man, lots there. So to kind of shift into that topic of ICPs, and whether we're talking about the stage of finding those first 10 customers, getting through the design and launch partner stage, or even into that 1 to 2 million or beyond to 3 or 10 million, I want to throw sort of a topic or a question, and we can break it down in different ways. Like, how do you, besides what you're describing and you're starting to sell, how do you either validate that the people you are selling to are in fact the right ones? How do you figure out if these are just good enough to get you out of the startup mode, and maybe now you shift a little bit to get into that ramp up mode? Like, how do you think about that, or what advice do you give to founders in terms of constantly evaluating and reevaluating who is the ICP?
Yeah, that's a good question. So number one is what I've just described. As you probably know, most founders don't do early stage, right?
No.
So it's actually something that just by doing it gives you a different lens as to how you're building the things that you need to build and how you're actually validating that initial kind of minimum viable business motion that I talked about, right? So generally speaking, founders will have a really good sense of the pain point, but really it's about understanding the segments and potential customers that will benefit from that. So we actually get down at Forum, we actually get them to go through a specific exercise that starts with an ICP where they'll take a look at, okay, so what does this industry actually care about? And why would they care about this solution, right? Is the industry ready for disruptive technology? Why? Why not? Why us, right? There's a set of questions that you have. You look at the industry, you look at geography, you look at, revenue, right? What bucket of companies are you looking at? You look at even specific challenges that they encounter. So all to say and this is why I use the word hypothesis. You basically map out what you think an ideal customer looks like, right? And you have an idea of how many there are there, and I'll get back to that. And you have an idea of also of their tech stack. Not only that, but you should probably also think about, okay, so if these are the type of customers that I think I should focus on that will get the best value from this solution, who's the buyer, right? So you actually go in and put together a buyer persona as well, like their title, their responsibilities, challenges, where are they in the org, what are their motivation, even like thinking about a promotion path. If it's more of a PLG product, but sometimes you kind of have to do it anyway, also do the same thing for your user persona, right? So effectively, you're kind of building this thing. And here's the thing that is ironic is that product leaders and technical leaders know how to do this for product. It's literally the same framework that you're using, but do it on the go-to-market side with that customer lens. And here's what that does. Very often at the end of this exercise, you have an initial kind of set of 1, 2, 3 potential ICPs before you go and have your conversations. But what you're able to do as you're having the conversation is that you can actually size the market that way, right? So generally speaking, when you go out and fundraise, investors will always ask you about, tell me about your TAM, tell me about your SAM, tell me about who you're going to focus on first.
Yeah.
And what I find founders do is that they'll usually come in and say, we're healthcare, software provider, and here's the software market size in healthcare. That doesn't tell me anything. And it doesn't tell the founders anything. Whereas if you kind of go through the exercise of doing ICP, buyer persona, and so on, what does your total addressable market become in that bottom-up way of looking at it? It really just kind of becomes, you take your number of total customers and multiply it by the average revenue per customer per year, because you'd have an idea, right, of what that looks like. And that's what actually gives you your bottom-up TAM, right? And then when it comes to your initial addressable market, maybe what you do is that you focus on some key target customers and do the same exercise, and it gives you your initial addressable market. And then your serviceable market becomes something a little different, but really looking at your revenue in 5 years. And the reason I'm going through all this is that generally speaking, just having the ICP exercise is something that helps you actually get to it, because you're not effectively saying, based on their conversations that I've already had, what's my ICP? It's actually backwards. Starts with, this is a problem that I think we want to solve. Who do we think is going to benefit the most from this solution? List out the best potential ICPs and then run the experiment. And the experiment is have the conversations, really dig in and understand their realities. And once you get to a point where you know enough to be dangerous, is actually when the sales process actually starts in a way in which we think about the sales process. Because that first kind of set of conversations with customers is really just learning. But you'll get to a point where you're confident enough to know, okay, I think I've got an idea of like who to focus on and what the potential solution might be. And then you start qualifying to figure out who's the actual ideal design partners and places that you're going to focus on, right? So it's a little counterintuitive, but you should actually start with the ICP before having conversations. And it's a better way of doing it, I think.
Yeah, there's again a lot there. I'm curious, like if you think about all of the companies that you've helped over the years, can you think of an example or two of a company that kind of went through this and there was like a really clear aha moment where they, even after going through a lot of this exercise, they thought they were going to go down one road. And because they did this, it was like, holy crap,
Yeah.
We were so wrong, and we had no idea how wrong we would have been.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we did this exercise so we could, make that switch or make that shift sooner before going too far down that road. In which case, it may not have even have ever been recoverable based on burn rate and time. So, any specific examples come to mind?
Yeah, I can give you two examples. I'll give you one. So for context, and you can probably tell, we do this with every single one of our portfolio companies, right? So I have plenty of examples there, but generally speaking, that's when early realizations come. So I'll give an example there that's just as recent as a conversation I had yesterday with the founder, right? So I'll touch on that. But I also want to give you a sense as to how this shows up once, if you didn't do it from the beginning, because it is possible that you can go through founder life up until Series A or Series B. And if you haven't done this exercise, that's when the issues are going to start showing up. And I'll give you an example there as well, because I've got a friend who has a company that kind of went through that, right? So I'll give you the first example, which is just a portfolio company that I was working with yesterday. The founder was early at MuleSoft and very, very deep in the data stack and data space and understand that space really well. And he's building, or he was, because after this exercise, we ended up pivoting, and I'll tell you why. He was building effectively a new form of notebook, right, for data scientists. And we looked at the market sizing initially, and we saw that there's a number of data scientists, and we also saw the number of data scientists that was going to keep going up into the right based on just more data and more needs for data scientists there. But once we actually went through the ICP exercise and looked at, okay, so who do you think could benefit from this? And there's a couple specific things that they're looking at. And his thesis really is that there's a new wave of notebooks that are being built that have the assumption, or have as an underlying assumption, that more business users will start using data notebooks and wanting to get into the data stack. His view is actually contrarian and opposite to that. He thinks that the notebook, that business users want to, generally speaking, get into the notebook app environment. And what he wants to build for is, we want to build for data scientists and really helping them with the things that they actually need the most help with, which is they're spending a lot of time on data analysis, and they're spending a lot of time on just some automation pieces that I won't bore you guys with. That being said, once we did the exercise, here's what we came up with. We came up short on our TAM exercise because the TAM that we looked at was a number that was sub 300 million, right? So if you looked at who we could sell to and what we could charge them, we did the TAM exercise and it looked like 300 million. And as soon as I see 300 million, I already know that's not a venture scale motion, right? Yep. Now, this is somebody who's got a good network of data scientists. So he could have gone and sold to his buddies over at MuleSoft and other types of customers, and probably ended up, we could have ended up with some really interesting early traction that would enable him to fundraise and do all those things. But the reality is, if you didn't do that early check, then you wouldn't know that it was going to be a grind to go from 250K to 1 million, 2 million, let alone 10, so on and so forth, right? So the exercise is important because one of two things generally happens with our portfolio companies once we go through this exercise. They either see that the market is not what they thought it was, right? The market appetite is not what they thought it was, in which case there's kind of two things you can do. You can either expand on the problem definition or the customer definition, or look for something else, right? In his case, we kind of had another idea that we're thinking about anyway. So that was something that we decided to kind of take a look at. But let me give you an example of something that actually does happen quite a bit. If you didn't do this kind of initial check of who's my ICP, and are there enough people are actually experiencing this problem in such an urgent way that I'm going to be able to sell to them, right? I have a friend, I'm not going to disclose any names there because this is a good friend, but Series B stage company, right? Okay. Successfully raised the seed, then got to a million two, and we're able to raise a Series B, which I would actually call it Series A because it was a 2020, 2021 Series B. I won't expand on that, but let's just say that this is somebody who's actually managed to raise north of $10 million. And when he was at Series A, because he was having, he kind of got in touch with me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about hiring a sales leader. Would love your feedback there." And the first thing that I look at when I usually get that question is that I go, "Okay, so who are your customers? Maybe give me a sense of the pain point, because I need to know what the ideal motion looks like to know what the ideal leader for that motion would look like," right? And what I saw was 20 different customers that purchased the product for 20 different reasons or are getting value in 20 different ways. That already tells me that, the product market fit is not fully there. But I once started digging into it to ask about, what's your ICP and who do you think that is? The reality was that they kind of went through the motion of really just leveraging their personal network to get their early deals. And it is possible to get to $1 million ARR just on your personal network.
Oh, easily.
Right. And which is what you need in order to raise a Series A. But if you didn't do the early check exercise of figuring out, are there enough customers that I can actually sell to, what tends to happen is that you might go all the way to $1 million, hire a sales leader that doesn't know any better. And guess what they're going to do? They're going to look at your 20 customers and go, "Amazing, find me 20 more of these," and effectively you have instead of having a motion where you've got a focused go to market, you're now going in 20 different places. And here's the other thing too, is that generally speaking, even though it's a misguided way to approach it, it does actually help you generate enough revenue to get to a Series B. Because arguably, if you can find one customer with that pain point, even though you've got 20 different types of pain points that you're solving for, the job is to find just, 2 or 3 more customers that look like these 20s. And maybe you get to $5-10 million. And by that point, the VP of sales did their job. But here's what actually happens when it's time to scale. How do you scale? That's when you have to typically put the brakes, because you'll realize really quickly that you don't actually have a repeatable sales motion. So generally, you'll find a company that goes seed, Series A, and then just stays there. And the reason
we call that sales purgatory.
Exactly, right? They're unable to unlock the things. How did you call them? I missed that.
A sales purgatory.
Sales purgatory.
Like you're out of the depths of hell that you now have customers and revenue. But you're like, there's so much more in the promised land up there.
Bingo.
But you just can't reach it. You're just in this state of purgatory. And often it's because you don't have that repeatability or scalability, which in what we're describing here goes back to not having a clear ICP. Well, I guess, so many more questions, but one more before we sort of get you out of here. And then I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about Forum Ventures. Somebody listening to this is like, okay, I get it. Like, I don't want to be that company. I don't want to be that company that gets to a Series B and $5 million in revenue and have to restart. But damn, I'm like, I got to get some revenue to show some traction before the next board meeting. And I just got to get enough revenue to get the next round. And then I'll figure it out, because like burn rates are up and funding's hard to get. And I just don't have the time. And so, 100%, like what they're talking about, I'm totally on board with it, but I'm going to do it later.
Yeah.
What would you tell that person?
Well, I have been in those shoes as well. I understand that sometimes as a founder, you have to do what you have to do to get to a milestone, right? I think as long as you're conscious of it, it's okay to do a little bit of that, right? And I say a little bit of that because the reality is, as you might have heard on this podcast before, you generally only can run one motion as a startup, right? And the more you have customers that don't kind of fit in that box, the more distracted you get. And distraction is just not a luxury that you have as a startup founder. And then the other thing that I would add to that is that in the current environment, in addition to investors looking for a repeatable motion for growth, they're also looking for efficient growth, right? And in order to get efficiency, you really have to not just look at the revenue side of the equation, but really have some repeatability with the underlying unit economics and cost structure as well, right? And having different types of customers will very quickly put you in a place where you don't really have a good grasp on the unit economics, which will come to hurt you later, right? So it's one of those things. So all to say, if you're at, say, 800K in revenue and you know that you need to get to 1 million in order to go out and fundraise, then do you to do a small callback there? Do you take that 200K Disney contract? I would say yes, right? But keep in mind that you want to make sure that one, those customers are not customers that are going to derail your roadmap. And number two, you want to be conscious of the fact that whatever it is that you're learning from that one customer does not actually influence too much how you're going to really focus your sales efforts in the future, and also how you're going to scale in the future, because you kind of really have to be in a point where you know exactly who your customers are, number one, because you know that you're going to deliver value and that there's many of them. But as soon as you get there, it's really about understanding the inputs that will lead to the outputs being revenue, right? And the only way to do that is if you're actually thinking of it as in experimental terms, by really focusing on a particular scenario.
Yeah. So what I kind of, to summarize that last piece, it's like the exceptions to the rule are okay as long as you know that they are the exceptions and they don't become the rule.
Bingo.
You know, that sort of consciousness about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, this is obviously, you know, I know you have an entire database. You're like ChatGPT when it comes to scaling from 0 to 1 and talking about these kinds of things. If people listening, obviously, you know, if they want to learn more about you and Forum Ventures, maybe tell folks where to go, how they can learn about what you're doing, and maybe how they can be one of those 120 companies that might get a check from you this year.
Thank you. So go to our website. It's forumvc.com, and you'll see plenty of places where you can pitch us there, or reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. I'm pretty good with LinkedIn as well. But generally speaking, if you're wondering whether Forum is a good fit for me, maybe it's just kind of how I'm going to answer this question, is that say that you're early and you've got an interesting concept, interesting idea in a massive market, obviously, which is kind of where you go, where you want to build a venture scale business, but you're struggling to really figure out your early emotions from a customer acquisition standpoint, right? And maybe you don't have the network, because quite often your early customers will come from your personal network, or maybe you don't have the personal network to help you get there. We have effectively platformized a motion to help our companies go out and acquire their first customers. Quite often, companies will start working with us pre-revenue, and by the time they're going out to fundraise, they'll have a few $100,000s worth of revenue so that they can go out and actually raise their seed round, as an example. The other lens I'll add to that is that sometimes folks actually are very good at building product and have some decent early traction, but there is such a thing as a science to how you fundraise. And thankfully, we've been doing this for 7 years and had hundreds of companies go through our program. We actually have north of 300 portfolio companies today that have all gone through the program. So to say, we have a pretty battle-tested fundraising program that helps our founders really understand just kind of the proper way to set a narrative, the process of managing that investor pipeline. Sometimes we'll go as far as, I mean, I probably shouldn't be saying this on the podcast, but we sometimes go as far as writing pitch decks for our founders.
Okay, you didn't say that. You didn't say that. Don't worry. You didn't say that.
So hopefully there is not too many investors that listen to this, but I'll just say, yes, there is such a thing as reframing the business and packaging the thing in such a way that it's attractive. Because remember, and this is kind of the one thing that I would want to leave with the listeners here that are founders, is that you're thinking about a minimum viable product, whereas investors are thinking about a minimum backable venture scale company, if you kind of think about it that way, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not just product, that's also, you know, your kind of go-to-market lens to that company, but also how you package the customer at that company and the story that you're telling there. And thankfully, those are two things that we're very good at Forum.
Okay. No, that's great. So again, that website for people listening is forumvc.com. And then you can find Bocar over on LinkedIn's Bocar, and last name is Dia, D-I-A. So easy to find, easy to connect with, and sounds like a kind of person that's happy to help you. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share your expertise, because, you know, as much as we talk about this stuff all the time, it's just so good to get somebody else who's been through it themselves, the way you have been through Hootsuite, and all of the experience that you've had now helping hundreds of companies over the years. So thanks for sharing some of your genius with us today. And we'll make sure to put all these links in the show notes. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I had. I think Bocar and I could probably geek out for hours and hours and hours about those things because both of us know, both because we've been startup sales leaders and because we work with early stage, growth stage startups each and every day. We've seen this hundreds, if not now thousands of times on how important it is to build that effective early go-to-market motion, that foundational process on which to build so that you can get more repeatability, more scalability in your sales and make the impact that you want to make with your industry, with your company. So thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or SoundCloud or Spotify, wherever you're listening. That's one favor I'd really appreciate. Number two, I'd also appreciate if you could leave us a review in those listening platforms. It tells us how we're doing, and it also helps to promote our podcast so that we can get the word out to more and more people just like you. So please do leave us a review so the rest of the world can find us as well. So one last reminder, if you haven't already, now's the time. Take your phone, open up your email app, send me an email, scott@salesqualia.com, scott@salesqualia, Qualia.com. Type the word private into the subject line, and let's get a call on the calendar so we can get a look at your sales process, take a look at your situation, help you jam on a few ideas, identify some blind spots, and get you on your way. So that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and we will looking forward to having you on listening to the next episode of the Startup Selling Show. That's it for now. Talk to you next time. See ya.